Okay, so this is week 2. I'm actually on vacation. I'm really enjoying gathering this information, and so have patience with me as I perfect what it is I'm trying to create here, which is really just a quick summary of news items that I couldn't find anywhere else, but I think that are interesting and could be followed up on. So I have written this all out and will be in my blog, but this is week 2 of my vlog attempt. So, number 1, Energy Secretary Steven Chu, along with several other departments in the cabinet, announced the quick permitting of long transmission lines. Now, long transmission lines are key to our energy independence, but a lot of other issues that cross state borders, across a lot of federal lands, and different things like that, and certainly a role that the federal government should play into. Interestingly enough, they did not announce any loan guarantees or subsidizations of these programs, just announced that they would help them fast-track the permit so that they could work faster on this. I did research one of the projects, and so this seems to be a little bit of a hyperbole, because one of the projects, SunZia out of Arizona, actually has been on track since 2008. In fact, predicted that they would start being able to actually work in 2014. I'm not sure that this fast permitting project actually helped them at all, although they do seem to be focused on it. SunZia, interestingly enough, is a project where they will take long transmission of electricity from a wind farm in New Mexico and transport it down into Arizona, and I'm assuming eventually into Nevada and California. Number 2, the Health and Human Services Department under Kathleen Sebelius. The FDA falls under this organization, and they announced a very ambitious, goal-oriented program. But one of the aspects of the program that I really liked was the announcement of fellowships that has to do with jobs. They say, look, there is a lot of unemployment in the United States, but there are a lot of unfulfilled jobs, and so their idea is that they would have fellowships at the FDA that would give young scientists an opportunity to learn how the FDA works, that they could take into industry, give them experience, and midterm scientists the opportunity to train at the FDA and hopefully take those off to gainful employments. Again, no announcement of federal money that would go into this, but that they would work with private organizations to fund these fellowships at the FDA. I thought it was a great idea that would actually help the structural problem with unemployment that people talk about. The Homeland Security Department under Janet Napolitano, they announced actually a long-working project which would be a national security goal that was tasked of them of a president directive, which I had never heard of. But anyways, I'm going to read you this goal exactly. It says, the goal is a secure and resilient nation with the capabilities required across the whole community to prevent and protect against, mitigate, and respond to, and recover from the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk. What's interesting is that there was supposed to be a follow-up risk assessment as to what would pose the greatest risks. I couldn't find that anywhere. My take on it is that maybe the greatest risks are things that relate to weather, hurricane, tornado, and maybe possible climate change, whereas most people would think that we'd want to spend most of our money on things like immigration or terrorism. Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan is the secretary there. This is like the 3rd week in a row, and there were actually several this week, where they announced enforcement of laws that prohibit the discrimination against families with children. So once again, they detailed that they looked on Craigslist, found listings for rentals. This was actually from a management company, not from an individual, where they absolutely were discriminating against families with children, and they were targeting them and enforcing the law that says that's not allowed. Now, I have mixed feelings about that law and whether that's a good law or how it should be enforced. But I think if it is a law, that it should be enforced. The Interior Department, Ken Salazar, announced actually, and I think this is pretty significant, the gray wolf is coming off the endangered species list. They consider it a success of the program for reinstituting the population. They are still planning on having the gray wolf population watched by the states, and they're waiting for them to submit plans on how they would actually do that, but they are coming off the endangered species list. Number 6, the Department of Agriculture under Tom Vilsack announced its support of the trade agreements that are stuck in Congress. Now, if anybody will benefit from these trade agreements, it is agriculture. We are one of the greatest agriculture-producing countries in the world, and a lot of countries subsidize their agriculture by putting tariffs on importing of agriculture. So the agricultural community will absolutely benefit from these tariffs. I know why it's stuck in Congress. They have what are called TAAs, which are trade adjustment assistance. Democrats are pushing that if someone loses their job because of a trade agreement that was launched, that they would get assistance into transitioning to another job or help in some way or another. Republicans, of course, don't want anything to do. Number 7, the State Department. Now, the State Department has a daily briefing, which is absolutely fascinating, and I love to watch. A lot of times, the press secretary, who is very familiar with his reporters, will be saying something like, "Well, I don't know. Let me get back to you on that. If you want to know how Russia feels about that, you'll have to ask them. But here's our take on it." And it's very cordial and back and forth. And so when this exchange happened, I was really caught off guard by the implications by how she answered it. And I'm going to read the exchange word for word here. She says, first of all, the question, "On Pakistan, please, I'm looking for a State Department reaction on the Pakistani government recommendation of treason against the doctor who is suspected of assisting the United States in targeting Osama bin Laden. I'm not going to have any comment on that issue." I hopefully will be able to insert the video here because it's very interesting. It says a lot about what she was not willing to say anything about, one way or the other. This was absolutely indicative of the State Department's feelings of the complexity of the relationship with. Number 8, the Transportation Department under Secretary Ray LaHood announced that Nevada had finally passed the law prohibiting texting or use of handheld devices while driving. They're the 9th state to do so. I really have mixed feelings on this. I'm not actually in favor of seatbelt and helmet laws, which have proved very successful and have saved lives. But I have a little bit of a libertarian streak along those lines. In Arizona, there are no helmet laws, although there are seatbelt laws. And I have seen several drivers texting, and you could always tell. You come up on them, they're driving slow, they're all over the lane, and you can see that they're actually texting as you pass them in the car. Number 9, the Treasury Department under Secretary Timothy Geithner. He was testifying before the Banking Committee, the House Banking Committee. A very interesting exchange. I read all of his comments and then watched the actual committee meeting. The thing that caught my eye is very interesting is the fight against regulations, whether they're good at all. The chairman, Baca, said, look, regulations are onerous and difficult. And then Representative Barney Frank says, yeah, people love to be against regulations in general, but refuse to name a specific regulation that they're against. He goes, I'd yet to hear a regulation that you said this is a bad regulation. It's just like being against it theoretically or philosophically, but not specifically. The chairman did ask Timothy Geithner, hey, is there anything that you feel like you need more regulation on? And he said, yes. The Consumer Protection Agency says that we have the ability to protect consumers, and yet we don't have anybody actually in place that will allow us actually to enforce any of those rules. The Department of Education and Arne Duncan, I was following some of their news releases, which I didn't quite understand until I caught one that said that there were going to be, if I could get this right, he says that there's going to be gainful employment statistics that are going to be required to be submitted from people, from organizations that receive federal funding. So, for example, if you are a hair salon, and yes, hair salons have a large chunk of financial aid, if you're a hair salon and you accept financial aid as part of your tuition package, you'll have to say, how long does it take someone to graduate? How much money does a typical student spend in graduating? How much loan debt do they have after they finish? And what is the real prospects of them gaining employment from having graduated it? I thought these statistics were very interesting and a great requirement on these organizations to report this information. Interestingly enough, I looked at some organizations like the University of Phoenix, the largest recipient of student financial aid, over $4 billion, which is 80% of their revenue. 80%. You look at a school like BYU, and only 10% of its population actually receives student aid of any sort, loans or otherwise. Number 11, the Justice Department under Attorney General Eric Holder, thought it was very interesting. A judge had ruled against industry in 3 separate cases. These industries had bought tax shelters, and the judge ruled that there was no business purpose other than to avoid tax, which is not allowed. So for the example of Wells Fargo, which had purchased a $3 million asset, which allowed them to claim a loss, which allowed them to save $80 million in taxes, the judge says there was no business purpose other than to avoid tax, and therefore threw it back at them and said that they couldn't do that. the Department of Defense. I thought this was very interesting. It didn't get very much play. The Secretary was in NATO headquarters with the President of Spain announcing that 4 Aegis ships, which are used for missile defense, would be stationed in Spain, and that Spain had agreed to allow these ships with 1,100 troops and 300 civilians that will support those ships to be stationed in Spain. Russia's against it, saying, look, we're trying to get a comprehensive missile defense agreement, and you keep putting these missile defense facilities in Poland and now in Spain. They're saying this isn't helping us to reach an overall agreement. I actually went to some of the Spanish newspapers to see what I could read from there, and their take was this was such a surprise. It's like the president was in town one day, and next thing you know, he's in Brussels making this announcement. Does he even have the authority to make such an agreement? Isn't this something that essentially Congress should be able to do? And then people were saying, hey, we joined NATO so that we would have fewer U.S. troops in in our country, and now you're saying that this is actually because we're in NATO, we're going to actually have more. So anyways, didn't get a lot of attention, but I thought it was pretty interesting.